what does it truly mean to live a good life? How do we even begin to figure out what's right and what's wrong? Not just for ourselves, but when we're living together in communities, trying to build something like a just society.
Hmm.
These aren't abstract philosophical games, are they? I mean, they shape everything from our personal choices to the very laws we live under.
Absolutely, they really do.
And here's something fascinating. These exact questions are some of the oldest recorded in what we now call Western thought, debated thousands of years ago in ancient Greece, and they still resonate powerfully today.
They absolutely do. These ancient debates are foundational, really, and understanding them is a real shortcut to grasping some of the core tensions that still define our world, our politics, and even how we think about what it means to be a good person.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a stack of sources, articles, research your notes, and dive deep, pulling out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight specifically for you, our listener. It's about getting well-informed, fast, with some surprising facts, and hopefully a bit of fun along the way.
And today, the sources you've brought us guide us back to a truly pivotal moment in intellectual history. We're exploring excerpts from a text on Western political thought, focusing on the incredible shift that happened in ancient Greece, moving from thinkers obsessed with the physical universe to those who turned their gaze inward towards human behavior, ethics, and the nature of the political community.
Right, this is the world of Socrates and his contemporaries, the Sophists.
Exactly. It's a period often described as the actual birth of political philosophy, kind of stepping out from the shadows of cosmology.
So our mission with this deep dive is to really unpack this material. We want to understand the fundamental clash between Socrates and the Sophists, because they disagreed on almost everything that mattered, didn't
That's
they?
very much, yeah, fundamentally.
And see how those profound philosophical differences led them to wildly different ideas about virtue, about society, about politics, and even about what it means to know something. And we're going to discover just how much these ancient arguments echo in the questions we grapple with right now.
It's quite striking when you see the parallels.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's really dig in.
All right. To really appreciate the revolution that Socrates and the Sophists brought about, we have to set the scene a bit. We need to go back even further to the very beginnings of Western philosophy, back to the 6th century BC. These were the thinkers we now call the pre-Socratics.
Right, the really early guys, the ones who were trying to figure out the fundamental stuff of the universe.
Exactly. Their primary focus was what they called physis, which means nature. They were essentially the first physicists trying to solve this grand riddle. What is the ultimate substance that everything is made of?
Okay.
You had Thales, who looked around and proposed, quite boldly actually, that everything was fundamentally water.
Water. Why water?
Well, he saw it in so many forms, liquid, solid, gas, and it seemed essential for all life, so it seemed like a plausible foundational element. Others came up with earth, air, fire, or, various combinations. Later on, you get Democritus, who developed the idea of atoms, these tiny indivisible particles, as the basic building blocks of everything.
So the big driving question back then was, what's the universe made of at its deepest level?
Precisely. That was the initial riddle. But as we move into the 5th century BC, some of these thinkers, or those who came after them, started asking more complex questions. It wasn't enough just to identify the stuff, they started wrestling with the problem of change.
Ah, okay. How does stuff become other stuff?
Exactly. If everything is water, how does water become a rock or steam? How does anything transform? This problem led to an even more fundamental philosophical puzzle. What is the true nature of reality itself? Is the universe in a state of constant flux, always changing, always becoming something new?
Or is there something permanent underneath it all?
Or is there some underlying, stable, permanent, unchanging reality beneath the appearances? This is where things get really interesting.
And this is where, as the source material points out, you see the emergence of these two foundational opposing tendencies in thought.
Yes, and this is a key insight right away. These two tendencies don't just exist back then. They represent a fault line that runs through Western thought for centuries, arguably right up to today. On one side, you had the philosophers of becoming.
Becoming, meaning change is the key.
Right. These thinkers, often materialists, saw reality as fundamentally change. Heraclitus is the famous example, the one who said you can't step into the same river twice because both you and the river are constantly changing.
Everything flows.
Exactly. They tended to view the universe strictly in material terms, believing reality was nothing more than what our senses could perceive. Change was undeniably real, and there was no need for like a divine or spiritual principle guiding everything. Democritus's atoms, in this view, combined purely by chance, by accident, no plan, no purpose, just stuff bumping into other stuff.
So reality is just a constant, unplanned flow of material stuff changing. A bit chaotic, maybe?
Potentially, yes, that's the essence of the becoming side. On the other side were the philosophers of being.
Being. So stability, permanence.
Exactly. These were often non-materialists. Parmenides is a key figure here. He argued, really counterintuitively, that change was an illusion, a deception of our imperfect senses. True reality, being, was a unified, unchanging, eternal entity.
Oh, that's a hard one to wrap your head around.
It really is. And then you have Pythagoras, a figure of immense importance who falls firmly in this being camp. He didn't focus on material substance, but on mathematical principles.
Right, the triangle guy.
Well, much more than that. He believed that beneath the chaotic, changing world we see and touch, there was a deeper, more basic reality of unchangeable mathematical patterns. To truly understand the cosmos, you had to grasp its underlying mathematical order. These thinkers insisted there was a reality beneath the sensory experience, an unchanging pattern or purpose.
Okay, so you have this massive early split. Is the universe just random material chaos, or is there an underlying permanent purposeful order? Is it all just stuff happening, or is there a plan?
That's a good way to put it. And here's where Pythagoras makes that critical early leap that sets the stage for political philosophy. He was arguably the first to connect this deep metaphysical debate about the nature of reality being versus becoming to human life, specifically social and political life.
How did he do that?
His idea was revolutionary. If you could understand and intellectually grasp the unchanging mathematical principles that ordered the cosmos, you could bring that same harmony and order into your own soul, your own inner life,
Okay.
and by extension, into your community, your polity, your city-state.
Wow. So he's saying understanding the fundamental structure of the universe isn't just academic. It actually tells us something about how we should live together.
Precisely. He directly linked metaphysics, the study of ultimate reality, to ethics and politics, how we should live and organize ourselves. It's a huge step.
Yeah, that is huge.
And the source text highlights that this divide, these two tendencies, arguing for a purposeful, ordered reality versus arguing for a chaotic, contingent reality, really patterns the entire history of Western political philosophy, even if later thinkers use different language. It's the debate between theories that find a natural order or purpose versus those that see everything as conventional or constructed by humans.
Which is a perfect bridge to our central figures. Because Socrates and the Sophists step into this world where philosophy is wrestling with these massive questions, but they fundamentally pivot the conversation, don't they?
They really do. Socrates, living roughly from 470 to 399 BC, is just this towering, almost mythical figure. The source compares him to Jesus in the history of Christianity, a profoundly influential teacher who famously wrote nothing down himself.
Nothing at all.
Not a thing. Everything we know about his ideas, his life, his methods comes through the writings of his students, most notably Plato. We're seeing Socrates through Plato's eyes, mostly.
And his story is dramatic, ending with his trial and death.
It's one of the most famous trials in history. He was brought before the Athenian court on charges that the source describes as false, corrupting the youth and impiety, essentially not believing in the city's gods.
Sounds like trumped-up charges.
Well, the source suggests they were politically motivated. Despite delivering a powerful defense, which we have in Plato's Apology, he was convicted and condemned to die by drinking hemlock. And crucially, he chose death over abandoning his principles or fleeing.
And arrayed against him, philosophically speaking, were the Sophists. They show up a bit earlier, starting in the early 5th century BC. Who are these guys?
The Sophists were a very different phenomenon. They were professional roving teachers. Think of them as highly paid consultants or intellectual coaches of their day, traveling from city to city, offering their expertise for a fee.
For a fee, that was unusual then, wasn't it?
It was. And it was one thing that set them apart and drew some criticism. Famous names include Gorgias and Protagoras. Their clientele was primarily young men from wealthy, ambitious families, the ones who wanted to make their mark, especially in politics. They wanted to learn how to succeed.
So they were essentially the first professional educators focused on practical success, particularly in navigating the political world, like how to win friends and influence people, ancient Greek style.
Kind of, yeah. You could call them the first political educators in Greece. And while, as the source notes, true political philosophy in the comprehensive sense really begins with Plato, the Sophists were the first to consciously philosophize about politics, even if their approach was radically different from Socrates.
Now, despite being philosophical opponents, Socrates and the Sophists did agree on one major thing, the sources say.
They did. They shared the conviction that the pre-Socratic focus on physis, on nature and physics, was fundamentally misguided for addressing the most important human questions. They looked at the debates about atoms or water and said, okay, interesting, maybe, but that doesn't tell me how I should live my life. It wasn't hitting the core issue.
Right. It didn't answer the really significant questions they did care about, which were
Ethical questions. This is the huge pivot. They turned philosophy's attention from the cosmos to human conduct. How should we live? What truly matters in life? What constitutes a good life, not just for an individual, but for people living together in a community?
This brings up a crucial distinction, one that Socrates helped clarify, between ethics and what we now call empirical observation. Can you unpack that?
Sure. The source material makes this distinction quite clear, and it's fundamental to understanding the Sophist-Socrates split. Ethics, or what philosophers sometimes call normative inquiry, is about values. It deals with concepts like good and evil, right and wrong. Ethical statements are about what ought to be or what someone should do. You ought to be just. We should pursue the common good. When you make an ethical claim, you're implying you have some knowledge of what is right or good.
Okay, so ethics is about the shoulds and oughts. How is empirical different?
Empirical observation is simply about describing what is. Empirical statements are based on our senses, on observation and experience. The sun is shining, the stone is heavy. Humans are motivated by self-interest. Modern science is overwhelmingly empirical. Its goal is to describe and understand the world as we perceive it, focusing on what is, not prescribing what ought to be.
And while we have clear terms for this now, Socrates was really instrumental in laying the groundwork for thinking in this way, even if the lines were blurrier back then.
He was. And the critical difference is that answering ethical questions, the ought questions, inherently depends on the ends or goals you have in mind. To say an end is good or bad requires an ethical standard, some idea of what you're aiming for. Empirical observation, on the other hand, just tells you facts about existence. It doesn't on its own tell you how to live or what goals are worthwhile.
Interestingly, though, there was one ultimate end that both Socrates and the Sophists seemed to agree on, despite all their differences.
Yes, both sides, like most Greek thinkers of the time, agreed that the ultimate goal of human action was happiness, eudaimonia. That's the target everyone was aiming for.
But here's the twist, the absolute core of their disagreement. They had completely different ideas about what constituted happiness and therefore completely different ideas about virtue, or R8.
Exactly. This is ground zero for their whole conflict, R8.
R8, that Greek word usually translated as virtue or excellence, but the source says it was broader originally.
Precisely. And it's important to remember its original meaning. Arete wasn't just moral virtue, like we might think today. It meant excellence in performing a function. You could talk about the arete of a knife, its sharpness, its ability to cut well.
Like it's good at being a knife?
Exactly. Or the arete of a runner, their speed, their ability to run well. It implied a specific function and a standard of excellence for performing that function, with the ultimate goal often being success or fulfillment in that role. The Greeks believed that achieving arete in your specific role, or in human life generally, was the path to happiness, to eudaimonia.
But Socrates dramatically changed the meaning of arete. He sort of moralized it.
He did. He took it from being a morally neutral term for functional excellence and imbued it with profound moral significance. He saw a deep connection between being good at a craft, like a shoemaker who knows how to make good shoes, and being a good human being knowing how to live a good life.
Wow.
For Socrates, there was an arete unique to human beings, an excellence proper to our nature, and achieving it was the key to genuine happiness.
And the absurdity, the tragedy he saw, was that people could agree on what made a good shoemaker or a good general, the skills involved, but they were utterly confused and disagreed about what made a good person, what constituted a good life.
Exactly. He found that staggering. People understand excellence in crafts, where knowledge clearly leads to a good product, but when it came to the most important thing, how to live, they were just stumbling around in the dark, relying on opinion.
And the stakes are much higher.
Oh, infinitely higher. If a shoemaker lacks ornate, you get bad shoes. Okay, annoying. But if a human being lacks ornate, if they don't achieve human excellence, they live a life of unhappiness and failure, even if they seem successful by conventional standards like wealth or power. Socrates found this widespread ignorance about human virtue tragic.
So the core question becomes, how did Socrates and the Sophists define this fundamental human virtue, this are innate? Because tucked inside those definitions, as the source suggests, are radically different blueprints for human nature, society, and politics. How you see virtue depends entirely on how you see the political community.
Absolutely. The definitions seem simple, but they unpack into entire worldviews. Let's start with the Sophists, shall we? Their definition of virtue is, for many people today, quite jarring.
Let's hear it.
They defined our eyesight in general as the ability to acquire things that bring pleasure or are commonly desired wealth, honor, status, power. And specifically, political virtue was defined as the ability to acquire these pleasure-giving things through the successful exercise of power.
Wow. Okay, so if you're good at getting what you want, especially through power, you have sophist virtue. It's very instrumental.
It's entirely instrumental. That's the core idea. It makes sense if you go back to the original idea of RS8 as excelling at a function to achieve a desired end. If the Sophists believed, as they did, that the end of politics was simply the acquisition of power and the things that come with it, then political virtue was mastering the techniques to achieve that end. Full stop.
Which immediately brings to mind their most famous teaching, rhetoric, the art of persuasion.
Absolutely. The Sophists were the first professional teachers of rhetoric, the art of persuasive public speaking. And crucially, they saw it not as a tool for revealing truth, but as the key technique for gaining power by effectively swaying and manipulating public opinion in the assembly or the courts.
So knowing how to speak well was the ultimate political skill for them.
It was the key tool for political era, as they defined it. So central to their political education was training young men to be masters of rhetoric, because that was the path to getting power and the stuff power gets you.
And their definition of virtue flows directly from their underlying view of society and human nature, right?
It does. It's all interconnected. The Sophists held what we call a conventional view of society and the state. They saw them as artificial constructs, mere arrangements or agreements made by humans for limited, pragmatic purposes, like providing basic security or preventing complete chaos.
So society isn't something natural or inherent, it's just something we cooked up.
That was their view. There was nothing inherently natural or organic about political order itself. And this stems from their psychological theory, their view of human nature.
What was that?
They didn't believe humans were naturally social or political animals, like Aristotle later argued. Instead, they saw humans as fundamentally individualistic egotists, driven primarily by self-interest, more concerned with their own desires and well-being than with any larger social good. That was their core psychological assumption. We're all just looking out for number one.
Okay, if society is just a temporary agreement between self-interested individuals, then what does that mean for laws and rules?
It means laws, customs, traditions. The rules of social order have no intrinsic ethical weight. They're just arbitrary rules, useful only insofar as they serve your interests or maintain enough order for you to pursue your interests. They aren't grounded in any deeper truth or goodness.
So the Sophists basically taught their students how to game the system.
In a way, yes. They taught them how to navigate this artificial social order, how to use, or crucially, how to circumvent its rules for their own benefit. Why be constrained by laws that are just conventional and lack any real ethical basis, especially if you're strong enough or clever enough to get away with it?
And this line of thinking could be pushed to a radical extreme, couldn't it?
Oh, it was. The most radical Sophists argued that in the absence of any natural justice within society, literally anything goes. They offered a powerful critique of the state and its laws, calling them an unnatural constraint on the individual's natural drives.
Unnatural constraint. How so?
They argued that in the state of nature, by nature, the strong dominate the weak. That's just how it is. Society, with its conventions like laws promoting equality or protecting the weak, interferes with this natural state of affairs. It holds back the superior individuals.
This is where that quote from Plato's Gorgias is so striking. Callicles arguing the sophist position.
Yes, it's a famous passage, really powerful. Callicles complains that society takes naturally strong, superior individuals, the potential rulers, and tames them like young lions, conditioning them from childhood to believe in equality and modesty, values that he says are against nature.
Taming them like lions.
Wow. And he argues that a truly capable man, someone with real natural ability, would eventually shake off these artificial laws and conventions, trample them underfoot, and allow the light of natural justice, which is the right of the strong, to rule and take what they want, to shine forth.
That image is unforgettable society domesticating its most powerful members with made-up rules. It's a complete rejection of conventional morality.
It perfectly captures their radical individualism. This doctrine didn't just justify self-interest, it glorified the individual, encouraging them to see themselves as above the law and custom, free to pursue their will. It has echoes in later philosophies celebrating the individual's power and self-creation, like Nietzsche's concept of the overman.
It's easy to see the appeal, especially for ambitious young men eager to get ahead in Athenian politics.
Absolutely. It told them they were inherently superior, that the existing rules were just obstacles designed by the weak majority to hold them back, and that their natural ability meant they were entitled to ignore limitations. It tapped into that, maybe adolescent disdain for traditional authority and gave it a philosophical justification.
But equally, it's clear why they were so unpopular and perceived as dangerous by many ordinary citizens.
For sure. The average Athenian saw the Sophists attacking the very foundations of their shared life. The laws, the traditions, the common understanding of right and wrong that held their community together. Their teachings seemed to threaten social stability itself, seemed amoral or even immoral.
Okay, so into this environment, step Socrates. How does he respond to this sophist view of virtue, society, and human nature? It sounds like he'd have a lot to say.
He certainly did. Socrates' response is direct and fundamental. He argues the sophist definition of virtue is simply wrong, precisely because it's built on a faulty understanding of what it means to be human and what society is for.
So what's his definition?
His definition, as we mentioned earlier, is deceptively simple, but profoundly different. Virtue is knowledge.
Okay, virtue is knowledge.
Okay.
But knowledge of what? Not just how to speak well, obviously.
Well, no, definitely not just technical knowledge like the Sophists taught about rhetoric, not knowing how to gain power. Socrates meant ethical knowledge, knowledge of how we ought to live, what is truly good, right, and just for a human being.
The oughts again.
Exactly. He went back to that craftsman analogy. A shoemaker needs knowledge of leather and tools and form to make good shoes. A human being needs knowledge of goodness and justice and temperance to live a good life. The array of a human, our specific excellence, is found in this ethical understanding.
And he challenged the sophists' ultimate ends, power, and pleasure directly, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. This is key. The Sophists said you seek power to acquire goods and find happiness in pleasure. Socrates turned that on its head. He argued that the ceaseless pursuit of pleasure, particularly the kind tied to satisfying biological desires, is not only fleeting but inherently linked to pain.
How does he link pleasure to pain? That sounds counterintuitive, too.
He uses examples like hunger and thirst. You feel the pleasure of eating or drinking only because you first experience the pain of hunger or thirst. Desire itself arises from a lack, a pain. Satisfying it brings temporary relief and pleasure, sure, but the desires are constant, tied to our biological needs. They keep coming back.
So it's like a leaky jar you can never fill.
That's an image Plato uses later, exactly. For Socrates, the sophist vision leads to a life trapped on a treadmill of constantly trying to fill a void, a life fundamentally rooted in oscillating between pain and fleeting relief, not genuine, stable happiness.
So a life dedicated to sophist virtue gaining power to pursue endless pleasure actually leads to individual unhappiness.
Exactly. That's Socrates' radical claim. And not just individual unhappiness, but societal misrule. Giving power to someone whose sole motivation is self-interested pleasure-seeking leads to a society focused on individual gain at the expense of the whole, disrupting any chance for collective well-being or justice.
This means Socrates has a completely different view of society and politics compared to the sophists' conventional model. It can't just be an artificial agreement for him.
Fundamentally different. If humans can attain knowledge of what is ethically true and good, then for Socrates, the ideal social organization should embody these truths. Society, government, law are not just arbitrary conventions. To the extent they reflect ethical truth, they are natural and essential for human flourishing. They are intimately connected to people's moral and psychological well-being.
So for Socrates, the state isn't just about keeping the peace, it's about helping people be good.
In a sense, yes. It's part of the environment necessary for achieving human excellence, for achieving virtue. This is the complete opposite of the sophists seeing society as just a pragmatic, artificial cage for the individual.
And it stems from a different psychological theory, a different view of human nature.
It does. Socrates believed humans are, by nature, social animals. We aren't self-sufficient. We need each other. Our very nature requires living in community. Think about it: language, cooperation, raising children. It all points to our social nature.
Okay.
And because we are social, there must be social and political arrangements that are naturally good, that contribute to the harmonious functioning of the community as an organism, that help us fulfill our nature. The Sophist doctrine, which teaches individuals to prioritize their own triumph over the needs of the whole, is inherently disruptive and unnatural from this perspective. It makes society sick.
So their disagreement about virtue leads directly to this massive debate over whether society and its rules are natural or merely conventional.
And this isn't just an ancient squabble. As the source text makes clear, this nature versus convention dichotomy is perhaps the single most important philosophical divide in the history of Western political thought. It's the bedrock of so many later arguments about justice, rights, and the legitimacy of government.
And it often dictates whether thinkers believe in objective ethical standards.
Right.
Like, if it's all conventional, then morality is just made up too.
Generally, yes, that's the pattern, though not always invariable. Theorists who see society and its norms as purely conventional, agreed upon, created by humans, often conclude that ethical standards are also relative, dependent on culture, context, or individual choice. There's no external benchmark.
Like the Sophists seem to suggest.
Exactly. Conversely, thinkers who see society as in some sense natural, rooted in human nature or a larger cosmic order like Socrates and many classical medieval thinkers, are more likely to believe there are knowable, objective ethical truths that ought to be recognized and embodied in social arrangements.
This distinction will keep popping up in later deep dives on other philosophers, won't it? I feel like we'll hear nature versus convention again.
Absolutely. It's a recurring theme because it goes to the heart of how we understand not just political order, but the source and nature of morality itself. It's fundamental.
Now, Socrates' definition of virtue as knowledge led him to a biting critique of the Sophists, not just on what they taught, but on their very claim to teach virtue.
Yes. This is where Socrates really cornered them logically. He asked, quite simply, how can you claim to teach virtue if you argue there's no objective, knowable standard of ethical goodness? If virtue is just about getting what you want through power, what is there to teach beyond mere techniques, like how to give a persuasive speech?
It's like trying to teach someone how to be a good doctor without knowing what health actually is.
That's a perfect analogy. The Sophists had the technical know-how. They could teach rhetoric, how to manipulate people, how to win arguments, like a craftsman who knows how to work materials. But Socrates argued they lacked knowledge of the appropriate end or purpose.
Right. The why.
Exactly. What makes a good argument? What makes a good use of power? Their assumption that the end was mere pleasure or power, in Socrates' view, demonstrated their fundamental ignorance of genuine human flourishing, of the true human telos or purpose. They were teaching skills without wisdom.
And he saw their teaching as actively harmful to society because it ignored the purpose, the why.
Right, because their theory undermined the very idea of a shared community governed by meaningful rules. How can you teach political virtue, virtue related to living well in a community, aponeurolus, when your philosophy teaches individuals to triumph over society's rules, ignoring the needs of the whole?
Seems contradictory.
Socrates insisted that political questions are always, at their core, ethical questions involving how we relate to each other morally, how we live together for a common good that is more than just the sum of individual self-interest. The Sophists just bypassed that whole dimension.
So Socrates defended the idea of order, but not necessarily the existing order in Athens. This is where it gets subtle, right? He wasn't just a conservative defending the status quo.
Yes, this is absolutely key to understanding why he wasn't just another radical sophist tearing things down. He defended the concept of social order and justice as natural and necessary. In the Gorgias, responding to Callicles' praise of the natural justice of the strong dominating the weak, Socrates gives this beautiful passage. Communion and friendship and orderliness and temperance and justice bind together heaven and earth and gods and men, and that this universe is therefore called cosmos or order, not disorder or misrule.
So he saw an inherent order in the universe itself, and ethical principles were part of that cosmic order.
Precisely. And ideally, human society should reflect that cosmic order. But, and this is the crucial but, he knew that any given law or any given political system could be flawed, could be unjust, made by ignorant men driven by opinion or self-interest, like the politicians and sophists he constantly debated. Such laws, though legally binding perhaps, were merely conventional in the negative sense, lacking grounding in ethical truth, in what is truly natural.
So his goal wasn't anarchy overthrowing everything, but reform. to make the actual social and political order compatible with what is truly natural and ethical.
Exactly. He wanted to bridge that gap between the ideal, natural, ethical order and the conventional, often flawed reality of political life. He was a social critic, but one aiming for a higher standard, not just tearing down for individual gain.
But his contemporaries often missed this crucial nuance, didn't they? They just saw him questioning everything.
They did. They saw him constantly questioning authority, challenging traditional beliefs about the gods, about virtue, about politics. And because he seemed to be undermining the status quo, many people, especially those in power, lumped him in with the Sophists, seeing him as just another dangerous figure tearing down values. They didn't see the constructive purpose behind his critique.
And that, tragically, is the real reason he ended up on trial and was condemned to death, according to the source.
The source text makes this point forcefully. His legal charges were impiety and corrupting the youth, but the underlying cause was political. He challenged the perceived wisdom and authority of the powerful in Athens, relentlessly exposing their ignorance through his questioning, and they saw him as a threat to the established order, despite his deeper aim of reforming it according to truth. It was, in essence, a political trial dressed up in religious and moral charges.
Which brings us to that incredible defining moment. His trial, his condemnation, and his refusal to escape, leading to his death. This seems like the ultimate expression of his philosophy.
Socrates' death is one of the most significant events in philosophical history, absolutely. By choosing to die rather than flee or compromise his teaching, they offered him exile if he'd just stopped philosophizing. Basically, he made a powerful statement. The philosophical life, the quest for truth and virtue, is superior to a life based on mere political expediency or the pursuit of pleasure, as the Sophists advocated. His death was a demonstration of his philosophy in action.
The story of his refusal to escape is most vividly told in Plato's dialogue, the Credo. What happens there?
Yes, it's a short but incredibly powerful dialogue. His wealthy friend Crito comes to him in prison with a well-funded escape plan already worked out. Bribery, safe passage, everything. Crito argues passionately for escape.
What are his arguments?
They're very practical, very understandable. Crito says things like, "What will people think of us, your friends? They'll say we were too cheap or too cowardly to save you." He mentions Socrates' duty to his young sons, who will be left orphans. He argues Socrates is betraying himself by accepting death when he could live and continue his valuable philosophical work. These are all very compelling, very prudent arguments from a worldly perspective.
But Socrates refuses. Why? His reasoning is fascinating, embodying that complex view of the state he held.
Exactly. He imagines the laws of Athens speaking to him. The laws argue that they are like his parents. They nurtured him, educated him, provided the framework for his entire life, including his marriage and the raising of his children. He lived in Athens his whole life, implicitly agreeing to obey its laws by choosing to stay. He owes the state obedience, a profound debt of gratitude.
But wait, didn't he just disobey the state by refusing to stop teaching when they implicitly condemned his teaching at the trial?
But that's the crucial distinction. His obedience is an absolute blind obedience. He couldn't obey the state if it meant violating his conscience, if it meant stopping his philosophical mission to seek and teach the truth, because that, for him, would be disobeying the divine command he felt he was under. That would be the ultimate betrayal of what he knew to be good.
So he couldn't obey the unjust command, stop teaching, but he felt he could and should obey the legal process, even when it led to an unjust outcome, his death sentence.
Precisely. This is the essence of his act of civil disobedience, as the source points out. It's a political act that asserts the ultimate authority of individual conscience and ethical truth above conventional human law, but, and this is vital, it simultaneously affirms the fundamental necessity and legitimacy of the state and the legal system itself by accepting its power to punish.
How does accepting punishment affirm the system?
By violating the specific unjust law, the implicit command to stop philosophizing, which led to his conviction, while willingly accepting the legal penalty, death, he showed respect for the overall framework of law and order. He wasn't an anarchist. He believed the state was necessary, even natural, but that its specific commands could be wrong and must be resisted ethically, while still acknowledging the state's authority to enforce its judgments.
It's a really profound way to carry philosophy into real life, isn't it? Finding that balance.
It's perhaps the ultimate example. By refusing to stop teaching, he affirmed the priority of his philosophical conscience over political expediency. By refusing to escape, he affirmed his belief that the state and the political community are fundamentally natural and necessary goods, even if the current laws or leaders are flawed and merely conventional. He wouldn't destroy the whole system just to save himself.
And his decision highlights that divide we mentioned between philosophy and prudence, doesn't it? Credo was arguing for prudence.
Exactly. Credo offered Prudence the practical, consequence-based arguments about family, reputation, continuing his work, what makes sense politically, socially. But Socrates refused to act on prudence. For him, true action must be based solely on knowledge of what is right, on truth, regardless of the consequences. Prudence, based on weighing outcomes, predicting reactions, is rooted in the realm of opinion and uncertainty. Philosophy, for Socrates, must stand on the firm ground of truth, even if it leads to death.
And this connects directly back to his core definition. Virtue is knowledge. How does that link work here?
Crucially so. If virtue is knowledge, then acting on anything other than knowledge, acting out of fear of death or desire for continued life or concern for reputation, all the things Credo appeals to, is unvirtuous. It is doing wrong. And doing wrong, for Socrates, always results in harm to one's soul, which is the ultimate unhappiness.
So his decision to stay and die wasn't just stubbornness. It was, in his view, the only way to remain virtuous, and therefore the only path to his own true happiness and the preservation of his soul's integrity.
Exactly. Escaping would have been an admission by his own actions that virtue isn't knowledge, that maybe physical survival or reputation is more important than ethical truth. It would mean his life's work, his entire philosophy, was based on a lie. His existence would become meaningless and miserable in his own eyes. Dying consistently was, paradoxically, necessary for his eudaimonia.
He completely rejected the common sense view that, a miserable life is better than no life at all.
Yes, because that view, he argued, is based on a shallow understanding of happiness, one that equates it with mere biological existence or the satisfaction of physical needs and avoidance of physical pain. Eating, sleeping, procreating, staying alive, that's not what constitutes true human happiness or a truly human life for Socrates. The quality of the soul matters more than the persistence of the body.
And his stance also addressed the fear of death, which Credo was clearly appealing to. Socrates wasn't afraid.
He famously argued that fearing death is illogical, even intellectually arrogant. To fear something implies you know it's bad, something to be feared. But, he argued, we don't actually know what happens after death. It might be annihilation, like a dreamless sleep, which isn't bad, or it might be a transition to another place where one could converse with the great souls of the past, which sounds pretty good for a philosopher.
So to fear it is to pretend you know something you don't.
Precisely. To fear death is to presume knowledge you don't possess, much like the politicians in his Apology who thought they were wise but weren't, or the Sophists like Callicles who claimed to know life's purpose, power, pleasure, without really understanding it. Fear of death for Socrates was a sign of ignorance, not wisdom.
It all culminates in that incredibly powerful statement attributed to him: the unexamined life is not worth living.
Yes. His absolute confidence in the power and necessity of philosophical inquiry, of rigorously examining one's own beliefs and actions to gain that ethical knowledge, is what allowed him to face death calmly, continuing to discuss philosophy, specifically the immortality of the soul, with his friends, right up to the moment he drank the hemlock, as depicted so movingly in Plato's Phaedo.
But this brings us to perhaps the most challenging question at the heart of Socrates' system, maybe the elephant in the room. Was this confidence misplaced? Does this certain objective ethical knowledge, this knowledge that virtue is made of, truly exist? Can we really know it with that kind of certainty?
That's the million drachma question, isn't it?
And how did Socrates know that he knew what he claimed to know, enough to die for it?
This gets to the core of his epistemology, his theory of knowledge. And you're right, it's crucial. For Socrates, his epistemology isn't just some side issue. It's absolutely central to everything he believes about ethics and politics. His dispute with the Sophists isn't only about the purpose of life or the nature of society. It's fundamentally about how we can know anything true about these things. How can Socrates be so sure he's right?
And part of his answer, famously, comes through the story of the oracle at Delphi, which he recounts in his Apology during his trial.
Yes, it's a pivotal story for understanding him. His enthusiastic friend Chaerephon apparently went to the oracle, the most revered source of wisdom in the Greek world, and asked if anyone was wiser than Socrates. The oracle, through the priestess, replied that no one was wiser.
And Socrates was baffled by this.
Completely baffled. He recounts how he felt profoundly ignorant, aware of how little he truly knew. So he embarked on a quest, he says, almost like a divine mission, to find someone wiser to prove the oracle wrong. He went to politicians known for their wisdom, poets known for their inspiration, craftsmen known for their skill.
And what did he find?
He found that these people, while perhaps skilled or knowledgeable in specific areas, fundamentally know nothing and think that they know. They mistook their expertise in one field or their popular reputation for genuine wisdom about the most important things, like virtue and justice.
And his key insight was,
His key insight was he, Socrates, also knows nothing or very little about these ultimate matters, but he knows that he knows nothing. He possesses what we now call Socratic ignorance or learned ignorance.
so his unique wisdom wasn't having all the answers, but having the profound humility to recognize his own lack of answers.
Exactly. For Socrates, recognizing and admitting your own ignorance is the absolutely necessary first step toward gaining genuine knowledge. The great obstacle isn't just ignorance itself, but ignorant people who think they are wise, like the Sophists, perhaps, or those confident politicians. They are unteachable because they aren't aware of their lack. They're closed off.
Whereas those who know they are ignorant,
Are open to learning, are willing to embark on the difficult quest for truth, and in that sense, they are already wise in the unique Socratic meaning. They have intellectual humility, which is the precondition for learning.
and he relentlessly applied this insight, this method of questioning, to expose the ignorance of others, which didn't exactly make him popular.
No, it certainly didn't. He saw it as his divine mission, prompted by the oracle to act as a gadfly, constantly stinging the lazy horse of Athens to wake it up from its intellectual slumber. He would question the leading figures, the politicians, the rhetoricians, the supposed experts, and through persistent logical questioning reveal the contradictions and lack of true understanding beneath their confident pronouncements.
Trying to help them see their own ignorance so they could start learning.
That was the idea. He was trying to help them, and the city, move towards wisdom. But as he noted wryly in the Apology, it primarily earned him a lot of powerful enemies, people who were embarrassed or angered by having their ignorance exposed publicly. And that, he suggests, is a major reason why he ended up on trial.
Okay, so knowing you're ignorant is the crucial starting line. But how do you actually move from that acknowledged ignorance to genuine knowledge? How do you get the answers?
This is where Socrates presents his positive method for acquiring knowledge, and it's deeply tied to his belief that knowledge isn't poured into you from an external teacher, but drawn out because it's somehow already within us in some fundamental way.
Already within us. That sounds strange.
It is a paradoxical idea. We need to learn what we already know. It's sometimes called the theory of recollection or anamnesis, especially as Plato develops it.
And the classic demonstration of this is in the Metono dialogue, with the uneducated slave boy and the geometry problem.
Yes, it's a brilliant and hugely influential scene. Socrates is discussing with Meno whether virtue can be taught. To illustrate a point about learning, Socrates takes a slave boy who, or explicitly told, has had no formal education, particularly in geometry. Through a series of carefully structured questions, crucially, never giving the boy the answer directly, only asking questions, Socrates guides him step by step.
Guides him to do what?
Guides him until the boy independently discovers and articulates a complex geometrical truth, a form of the Pythagorean theorem related to doubling the area of a square. The boy works it out himself, correcting his own initial wrong answers when Socrates' questions reveal the contradictions.
And the argument is, how could this boy, with no training or specific experience in geometry, possibly know this unless this knowledge, or the capacity to derive it logically, was somehow already within him, waiting to be recollected?
That's Socrates and Plato's conclusion in the dialogue. And Socrates argued that what's true for mathematical knowledge, which seems universal and necessary, not just empirical, is also true for ethical knowledge. Just as the slave boy could recollect geometrical principles from within, we can, through the right process, access the ethical truths, the concepts of justice, beauty, goodness, that are somehow already present in our minds or souls.
This leads to Socrates' incredibly important discovery, or at least articulation, of the concept.
Yes, this is a key epistemological insight credited to him. A concept is a general, abstract idea that allows us to recognize, classify, and understand particular things. The slave boy doesn't just recognize the specific square drawn in the sand. He grasps the concept of a square, or more precisely, the concept of geometrical relationships, like doubling an area which applies to all squares. He has the concept of triangleness that lets him see any specific triangle, however different, as an instance of a triangle.
Okay, and Socrates applied this to ethics.
Exactly. He argued that similarly, we recognize specific acts as courageous, or just because we possess the prior generalized conceptual knowledge of courage or justice. We have an innate template, so to speak.
And this conceptual knowledge is different from just having opinions about things, like the Sophists had.
Massively different. For Socrates, this conceptual knowledge is inherent, universal, and unchanging, like the Pythagorean theorem. It's true everywhere and always. It's not like the opinions of the sophists or the politicians, which are particular, relative, often contradictory, and constantly shifting like the physical world of becoming. This conceptual knowledge is not conventional. It is somehow naturally within us, part of the structure of reason itself. Philosophers later called this a priori knowledge, knowledge independent of specific sensory experiences.
So if the knowledge is already inside us, how do you draw it out? What's the method?
The method is the Socratic method itself, the dialectic. Since the knowledge is within you, it can't be effectively forced in from the outside by lectures or passive learning. It has to be drawn out, actively discovered by the learner.
Like a midwife helping someone give birth to their own ideas.
That's exactly the metaphor Socrates famously used. The dialectic involves dialogue, rigorous question and answer. The teacher, Socrates, doesn't lecture. He asks critical questions that challenge the student's initial opinions or definitions, like, what is courage? These questions reveal inconsistencies, limitations, or contradictions in the student's view.
And the student is forced to rethink.
Exactly. The student, if they are honest and truly seeking truth, sees the flaws in their own opinion and is logically led to refine it, modify it, or abandon it entirely, moving closer and closer to a more adequate, comprehensive, genuinely conceptual understanding.
It's like a logical pressure that pushes the mind towards truth by eliminating error.
That's a good way to put it. Dialectic, through rigorous logical cross-examination, taps into the mind's innate logical structure and guides it away from the fuzzy, inconsistent realm of opinion, what the Greeks called doxa, towards the clear universal realm of knowledge, episteme. Opinion, for Socrates, is the opposite of knowledge. It's rooted in the changing world of appearances, becoming, while knowledge is a grasp of the unchanging essence, the concept being. The philosopher, through dialectic, strives for this conceptual grasp. The sophist remains content to manipulate opinions.
And this is precisely why Socrates was so critical of what the Sophists were teaching. He thought they were stuck at the level of opinion.
Exactly. Because they weren't teaching knowledge at all, in his view. They were teaching opinion. And worse, they didn't even realize the distinction because they had no concept of the concept. They didn't understand what true universal knowledge even looked like.
So they were just reflecting popular beliefs back.
Pretty much. They taught the prevailing common sense opinions about virtue, the idea that pleasure is the greatest good, that success means accumulating wealth and power opinions, accepted by what Socrates might call the Philistines, or the unthinking masses, the people living unexamined lives.
And they had definitions for different virtues, maybe, but no concept of what virtue itself truly was, the underlying essence.
Right, like knowing what different triangles look like or having different opinions about different triangles, but not grasping the underlying mathematical concept of triangleness that defines them all and explains their properties. The sophists could talk about specific acts people called courageous or just in different situations, but they couldn't define the universal essence of courage or justice that makes those acts virtuous. They lacked the unifying concept.
And their tool, rhetoric, was perfectly suited to manipulating opinion, not uncovering conceptual truth through dialectic.
That's the core difference in their methods and goals. Rhetoric is about persuasion, about swaying public opinion, making the weaker argument appear stronger, appealing to emotion and convention. The sophists taught their students how to change people's opinions to achieve practical ends. Socrates, through dialectic, sought to help people rise above their fluctuating opinions to attain unchanging conceptual truth.
Which also explains why Socrates' mission was so difficult and often made him unpopular. People don't like having their opinions dismantled.
Not at all. People are much more attached to their comfortable opinions, especially collectively held ones, than they are to the difficult, often unsettling, pursuit of truth. Dialectic only works if the student is genuinely committed to following the argument wherever it leads, even if it means admitting they were wrong. Many people aren't willing to do that.
This idea of conceptual knowledge and reason being able to access it seems to go beyond just the individual mind for Socrates. It points to something bigger, doesn't it?
It does. For Socrates, and even more explicitly for Plato after him, the fact that our minds can grasp universal, unchanging truths like mathematical principles or objective ethical concepts suggested that the human mind's logical structure must somehow be connected to, must reflect, a larger cosmic order. Truth couldn't just exist subjectively within each person. It had to correspond to something real outside us.
So his thought connects back to those early pre-Socratic philosophers of being, like Pythagoras, who saw order in the universe.
Absolutely. Just as Pythagoras saw a fundamental mathematical order in the cosmos, Socrates saw that our capacity for rational, conceptual thought pointed to a real, objective order and purpose in the universe itself. Our reason participates in a universal reason, you might say.
And crucially, this order wasn't just mathematical or physical, but also ethical.
Yes. Since humans could attain ethical knowledge, could grasp concepts like justice and goodness, this universal order must include an ethical dimension. The universe itself must have an inherent purpose that aligns with goodness and justice. It's not just random stuff happening, there's a moral structure to reality.
And this aspect of his thought, this idea of a rational moral universe, made it relatively easy for later traditions like Christianity to incorporate some of his ideas, didn't it?
Very much so. The source material points this out. The idea of a rational moral universe underlying physical reality could be readily mapped onto the concept of the mind of God, or divine reason. Socrates' idea of accessing inner knowledge through reason could be seen as a form of divine illumination.
Did Socrates himself talk in religious terms?
He certainly did. He often referred to God or the divine or his daemonion, a divine sign or inner voice. He believed in the immortality of the soul and seemed open to ideas of life after death or even reincarnation, which for him, as mentioned in the Meno, offered one explanation for how we could have knowledge already within us, perhaps learned in a prior existence.
Though, as the source notes, you don't necessarily need those specific religious theories today to appreciate his core point about conceptual knowledge and reason.
Right. We have different frameworks for understanding logic, epistemology, and cognitive science now. We don't necessarily need reincarnation to explain innate cognitive structures or the power of reason, but the fundamental Socratic question he raised remains profoundly relevant. Is human reason just a product of random material processes, an evolutionary accident? Or does our ability to grasp universal truths suggest we are connected to some deeper order or purpose in the universe?
And Socrates' driving goal was political, in a way to try and structure human social and political relationships in accordance with that perceived larger ethical order.
Precisely. To make the city reflect the cosmos, to make human law align with natural ethical law.
And this forms his ultimate devastating criticism of the Sophists, doesn't it, from his perspective?
Yes. Their fundamental flaw, in Socrates' view, was their blindness to order and purpose, whether in the cosmos, in the state, or even within the individual human soul, which they saw as just a bundle of appetites. Because they recognized no objective ethical order, their concept of virtue inevitably devolved into a mere power struggle, a technique for selfish gain.
And this blindness wasn't just a moral failing, but an intellectual one.
Exactly. Their inability to see this larger order stemmed directly from their inability to understand true knowledge. They were trapped in the realm of opinion, unable to grasp the unchanging concept, the universal form. They had no concept of the concept. And their political theories, advocating radical individualism and justifying disregard for social norms, were simply a reflection of this fundamental intellectual and ethical blindness, promoting chaos and disorder rather than the harmony Socrates believed was natural and achievable through reason.
So Socrates' impact is truly transformative for Western thought, even beyond his specific answers.
Absolutely. His insistence on the central role of reason, his idea that there are knowable ethical truths, even if defining them is hard, and his radical vision that human institutions ideally should reflect a rational moral order became cornerstones of the Western intellectual tradition. It's almost impossible to imagine Western philosophy without him.
He laid the essential philosophical foundation for political philosophy by shifting the focus to the ethical core of human life.
Although, as the source notes, he was primarily concerned with the moral state of the individual soul, albeit not in isolation from its place in the community. His focus was more ethical and epistemological than constructing detailed political blueprints.
He was definitely a critic of Athenian democracy as practiced, exposing its flaws. But he wasn't a political architect himself, offering a complete alternative system.
No, that monumental work was taken up by his greatest student, Plato. Plato took Socrates' revolutionary insights, the idea of knowable ethical truths, forms, the importance of the concept, the dialectic method, the critique of opinion, virtue as knowledge, and combined them with the ideas of the pre-Socratic philosophers of being, like Pythagoras, who saw a perfect, unchanging mathematical irrational order underlying reality.
And the result was?
The result was Plato's magnificent works of political philosophy, like the Republic, which attempts to design an entire ideal state based on these Socratic and Pythagorean principles. That's where political philosophy as a systematic enterprise truly begins, launching a tradition that continues to shape our world today. Socrates lit the fuse, and Plato built the structure.
Wow, what a journey through these foundational ideas. It really sets the stage for so much that follows. Let's just quickly recap the main threads we've pulled out in this deep dive.
Sounds good. We began way back with the earliest Greek thinkers, the pre-Socratics, and saw how their initial focus on the material universe, what's it all made of, evolved into a really fundamental debate about the very nature of reality itself. Is it constant change, flux, becoming?
Or is there a permanent, underlying, stable being? And we saw how early on, figures like Pythagoras started linking that cosmic order, if it exists, to the possibility of harmony in the human soul and the community, basically bridging metaphysics and ethics right from the start.
Then came the pivotal shift with Socrates and the Sophists. They turned philosophical inquiry squarely onto human beings and the vital questions of how we ought to live, really the birth of ethics and political thought, as distinct fields, moving away from just physics.
We contrasted the Sophists, who defined virtue very pragmatically as the ability to gain power and pleasure, essentially succeeding in the world. They saw society as just a human invention, a conventional agreement between naturally self-interested individuals.
And some sophists push this to the extreme, advocating for a kind of radical, might makes right individualism that challenged all social rules as unnatural constraints on the strong.
Then Socrates enters with his profound counter-definition. Virtue is knowledge. Not just any knowledge, but ethical knowledge, understanding what is truly good. He argued that this true understanding compels right action and is the only path to genuine, stable happiness, completely rejecting the Sophists' endless pursuit of fleeting pleasure tied to pain.
And his view required a different take on society. For Socrates, society and law weren't just conventional, they were potentially natural, capable of embodying ethical truths. He saw humans as inherently social animals who need harmonious communal arrangements to flourish, making the Sophists' disruptive individualism seem fundamentally misguided and unnatural.
Their vastly different conceptions of virtue, human nature, and society ultimately stem from contrasting ideas about knowledge itself. The Sophists, in Socrates' view, were stuck in the changing world of opinion, doxa.
While Socrates believed true, unchanging knowledge, conceptual, ethical knowledge, episteme was attainable, residing somehow within us and accessible through the rigorous back-and-forth method of dialectic, starting, crucially, with the essential humility of admitting one's own ignorance.
And this profound belief in knowable truth, in the absolute primacy of his ethical conscience guided by that truth, led directly to his ultimate act of defiance and death, his famous act of civil disobedience. It was a powerful demonstration that the philosophical life, dedicated to truth, had to take priority over conventional politics or even survival when core principles clashed.
A demonstration that also, paradoxically, affirmed the necessity of law and order by accepting the penalty.
And we noted that the fundamental debate running through all this nature versus convention is so central to their conflict and remains a vital lens for understanding political thought throughout history and even today.
So, wrapping this all up, why does any of this ancient debate from 2,400 years ago in Athens, hold any weight for you today listening to this?
Well, think about our own public conversations, our politics, even just everyday interactions. So much of our discourse seems focused on persuasion, on gaining influence, on mastering the techniques of communication to win arguments or acquire power or status. Doesn't that sound a little like the Sophist emphasis on rhetoric and power as the measure of virtue?
And are we collectively or even individually really trying to seek out a deeper, perhaps knowable truth about how we ought to live together, about what constitutes a genuinely good society? Or are we mostly content with navigating a world of constantly shifting opinions and competing self-interests?
Do we see laws and social norms as fundamentally arbitrary, just temporary conventions we can bend or break if we can get away with it, or if they inconvenience us? Or do we hold on to the Socratic hope that they should, and ideally can, reflect some more fundamental natural ethical order that actually benefits everyone in the long run?
And when you're faced with laws or societal expectations that feel deeply unjust to your conscience, what's the response? Do we simply comply out of prudence, weighing the practical consequences of resistance? Or is there sometimes a call, perhaps echoing Socrates, for a different kind of response, one that stands firmly on principle, even while acknowledging the general need for social order? It's a tough balance.
It really does make you pause and reflect. And here's a final thought to chew on. If Socrates was right, if virtue truly is knowledge, and if wrongdoing stems only from ignorance about what's truly good for us, What does that actually say about the nature of what we call evil? Is it just a profound, perhaps tragic, lack of understanding?
And that bigger Socratic question still looms large. Can we, in the end, truly attain that kind of certain transformative ethical knowledge that Socrates seems so confident about, confident enough to die for? Is that kind of wisdom accessible to us?
And maybe the most personal question he leaves us with. If the unexamined life is truly not worth living, are we dedicating enough time and effort to examining ours?
Profound questions indeed. This concludes this deep dive into the foundational clash between Socrates and the Sophists, a deep dive shaped by the source material you provided.